What is up? Welcome back to another book review. Today we're going to be talking about Let Us Pool Our Money Together by Tim Todd. This book was gifted to me by my dean here at Oklahoma City University, Dean Agee. Thank you for sharing this book with me. It was a really great read. I learned a tremendous amount that I'm going to be sharing in this video with you guys. Not only about just like the history of banking, but also about some of the unique struggles of black entrepreneurs throughout history as it relates to the financial service industry, but also other endeavors as well, right? Because one thing that you learn by reading this book is that the history of black banking in America is a very sad history. It's a history of exploitation, a history of taking advantage of sort of the most disenfranchised. It's a history of theft, a history of fraud. And I think that we live at a very critical moment in history where banking services and the financial service industry as a whole is evolving. And black people have historically, you learn and read, they've always been on the outskirts, right, of a lot of different endeavors, but particularly the financial service industry. And so Tim Todd is the executive writer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. And he says, well, let me first start off by saying he did not write this alone. Or no, he did write it alone, but he had a researcher, Cindy Edwards, and he gives thanks to Juliet E.K. Walker for her contribution. So I felt like it's appropriate to mention them as well. And this is a new book. It just got published like last month. And in the beginning notes, he says, generally, this is kind of getting to why he wrote this book. Generally, books addressing the early history of African American banks have done so either within a larger construct of African American business history and economic development, or as a starting point to explore current issues related to financial services. Focused consideration of these early institutions and their founders have been relatively rare and somewhat scattered. This publication seeks to address this issue. This is still in the beginning parts. I kind of want to just start off by reading a couple of excerpts and then jump into so this book is extraordinarily well researched, right? Like Todd does a tremendous job at not only like bringing in like the narratives, but also backing this up with like historical empirical evidence and really painting a holistic picture for the reader. It's just tremendously well researched and written. And so you have to, you just want to point that out. He says, it also helps to illustrate why a somewhat detailed understanding of slave-era America is necessary framework for any thoughtful review of the first banks owned by and serving black Americans. So at the beginning of the book, he starts off by talking about the institution of slavery. And one thing that I learned just in the beginning pages is that slaves were actually used for about 80 to 90% of collateral for loans, right? So it really, for me, when I read that, it kind of like made me, you always hear about like slavery as like the economic foundation, right? Like the fabric of the South. But when you stop and realize that farmers and plantation owners and people who lived in these southern states, slaves were the lifeblood of it. Slaves were their gold, right? It was their their unit of account, kind of, or their medium of exchange. It was property, and it just goes to show that 80 to 90% of loans were collateralized by humans, and that really touched me, and it really spoke to me. But he starts the book by talking about slavery, and then he works into sort of post Civil War era. Once blacks had got their freedom, one of the first institutions that was founded was something called the Freedmen's Banking Trust, right? And this was an institution established in Washington, D.C. It was established by a couple of cohorts of individuals, but three of the main standout people in this were Henry Cook, Jay Cook, and John Alfred. And the Cook brothers were not nice people. They took a lot of federal funds. They built an outlandish bank for themselves, right? And it was beautiful prime real estate in D.C. They decorated the interior of the bank with just beautiful decorations and curtains and all of this, art and such. And the services that they provided were exploitative, and they were dishonest. And you read, Todd tells how the Cook brothers basically used the banking institution to route money to their own business endeavors, and they did not manage the funds of the people very well. One of the things that was really interesting about this first banking institution is that it was entirely white owned and white ran. All the leadership were white people, and yet the bank marketed itself as a bank for black people. And this is true not only empirically. You look at the fact that all 36 branches of the bank were located in the South. It's estimated that 1% of black wealth was being saved and concentrated in these banks. And the bankers completely mismanaged the people's funds. And whenever the bank went under shortly after, no depositors were made whole. One thing I thought was really interesting was the marketing material. And Todd talks about this in the book. He talks about how the marketing material that was used to try to get black people to put their money in these banks was childish in nature, in that it was derogatory. And he does a good job of highlighting exactly how that is. And it's a very sad ending, obviously. It was an abuse of trust, right? And it took a while. There were many attempts afterwards for blacks to try to create banks, and it wasn't until 1865 that they were finally able to do so. But before I jump into the first bank that was chartered, right? Because the first bank that was chartered was not actually the first black bank that was operational. We want to start by examining sort of the evolution of capital, right? The evolution of capital lending as it relates to the Black America and Black history. And what you read in this book and what you learn is that there are a number of struggles, right? Number of struggles that Black businesses underwent throughout their history, whether it be in the legal landscape, right, or facing the threat of violence. But the number one issue was access to capital, access to money to start businesses. And it was often the case that if Black people started to organize together, that they were often threatened by violence. Maybe violence was actually taken upon them. And so some of these early lending institutions were actually very underground lending in the form of burial fraternities, right? So these were groups of slaves or groups of Black people who would come together. And actually it even goes back to slavery as well, because what you read and learn is that the burial was one of the only places and times that slaves could actually be alone, and that they did not have to worry about the threat of white violence, and they were kind of left to their own accord. And so these burial organizations started to coalesce, and they would provide money for widows. And later on, there were other fraternal organizations, religious in nature. So I'm going to actually refer to my notes here. There was one called the United Order of True Reformers, and this they birthed from the Order of Good Templars, right? And they were the first bank in 1865, or the first fraternal organization that was able to create a bank, and the name of the bank was called the Savings Bank of the Grand Fountain, right? And so I had that written above because I knew I'd forget it. And this is I'm here on in the photo gallery, right? And I hopefully this isn't like copyright infringement, but I do want to kind of show you guys this picture in particular, right? And what it says underneath the caption is, "The Savings Bank of the Grand Fountain, United Order of True Reformers, operated out of the first floor of a 3-story building the order constructed in 1891. The building, which was also home to the order's headquarters, was at the edge of Jackson Ward area of Richmond, Virginia." But I wanted to show that to you guys because I wanted you to see how grassroots these banks were, right? And to hear from that little excerpt right there that they were literally just using their own club building to try to create a bank and just to have a place where people could go and put their money and store their money. And we take for granted today, the privilege of banking, right? Andreas Antonopoulos talks a lot about in some of his speeches, and Bitcoiners who watch this and subscribe to my channel will probably know who Andreas Antonopoulos is, but he talks a lot about how the privilege of banking, and he talks a lot about the unbanked. And part of why I'm excited to talk about this book today is because tomorrow I'm going to record a video of a book by a guy named Isaiah Jackson called Bitcoin in Black America, which I think is a great sort of corollary to the history of the first black banking institutions. And we'll look forward to talking to you guys more about that tomorrow, and hopefully you guys tune in for that video, right? But so the problem with some of these first banks, right, is that they didn't last very long. They failed for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they were under-resourced. Sometimes they were poorly managed, right? These were people who had no experiences outside of, being property. And so another bank that came into existence was a bank called the Capital Savings Bank, and this was established by a guy named Milton Howard, and he was the descendant of a slave owner and his slave from Texas. And he was able to build Capital Savings Bank, which arguably was one of the most successful banks of this era, but it only lasted for approximately 30 years before it went under as well. And so you see there's two other banks that the book talks about. There's the Penny Savings Bank, which was located in Alabama, and this was started by a Reverend Pettiford, William Pettiford. He started this bank, and it was an offshoot of his work in the bank. The bank came about as an offshoot of his work in sort of religion and trying to help churches establish funds for themselves and to be able to like those burial funds and be able to look after their members. And he learned a lot about financial management and was able to eventually apply those skills to a penny savings bank. And he also really much the bank practiced temperance and thrift. At one point, Todd talks about how Pettiford would walk around Alabama and he would see people drinking, and he would become very disheartened by seeing people who were spending money on things that were killing them rather than savings and trying to build things. And one of the last banks that is talked about is the St. Luke's Penny Saving Bank, which was established. I actually don't know who established it, but I know that the first president was a lady named Maggie Lena Walker. And Maggie Walker is historically known and lauded as the first black female bank president. And at this point, I'm going to kind of turn to, this is a quote from her on page 104. "We need a savings bank. Let us put our money together. Let us use our monies. Let us put our money out of usury among ourselves and reap the benefit ourselves," she said. "Let us have a bank that will take the nickels and turn them into dollars." Under Walker's leadership, her vision was realized with the opening of St. Luke's Penny Savings Bank in 1903. On the first day, it got $8,000 in total deposits from 280 depositors. And there was one other thing I wanted to point out. I think it was in the epilogue. This is in the epilogue of the book. Shortly after Walker's Bank was established, America underwent a black renaissance of financial businesses. And then Todd writes, "Between 1900 and 1930s has been referred to as, quote, the golden age of black business, with black entrepreneurs and capitalists achieving success within a black economy, which developed in response to the nation's rise of two worlds of race." He goes on to talk more about how after the 1930s, sort of the decline of banking, which is not, well, of banking in general, and then also of black banks, which was not necessarily unique to black America, but was a general trend across the United States. A couple more things I want to read from the epilogue. "In analyzing data compiled through 2011, the authors found poverty rates of almost twice the national level in communities served by black-owned banks. with the data implying that these institutions are located in areas that other banks view as unprofitable. In considering these studies, it is also important to keep in mind that nearly 1 out of every 5 black households in the United States is unbanked, and nearly 1 out of every 3 is considered underbanked, meaning while they might have a checking account, they receive other financial services outside the traditional banks, such as from payday lenders. Yeah, okay, I thought that was going to go on, but here we go. Because minority communities are often underserved by mainstream financial service providers, residents of these communities may believe the exploitative terms offered by pawn shops, payday lenders, and checking cashing services are the standard. And I think this is going to be how I end this video, because I'm going to pick up tomorrow with, like I said, Bitcoin in Black America, which Isaiah Jackson kind of starts to address some of these issues of, redlining and exploitative lending terms, and being underbanked and being discriminated against, and sort of the way that interest rates are determined. I want to close by saying that this was a phenomenal read. Anyone who's interested in the history of banking, anyone who's interested in African American history, anyone who just wants to learn a little bit more about American history, I highly encourage that you read Tim Todd's book. I'll have a link in the description. Hopefully I'm able to find where you can buy this, because like I said, it was gifted to me. So I tried to find it. It's not on Amazon. I don't know where. I'll have to figure out where that is. Yeah, I give this book a 4.5 out of 5 stars. It's a very quick read, but it's extremely informative and informational. So, Mr. Todd, if you're watching this, thank you for writing this. This was very important. See you guys in the next video. Peace.
Law.